Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our Think Fast forum tonight on the war in Ukraine. My name is Catherine Nichols. I'm the Senior Coordinator for Faculty Relations and Travel at the University of North Carolina General Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us tonight. A special thank to our GAA members who help make events like this possible. This event is going to be recorded and will be available for viewing in the future. We hope to have it available tomorrow. We will send out an email to registrants to let you know when it is available. We have received many questions ahead of the event this evening. If questions arise that you'd like to present to the panel, please type them in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them. But please do realize we have many, many more questions than we could ever get to. So to start off the evening, I would like to introduce our moderator, Klaus Lars. He's the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and also an adjunct professor in the curriculum of Peace, War, and Defense.
Thank you, Catherine. Good evening, everyone. I would also like to welcome you to our exciting panel, which unfortunately has been convened due to the very sad and terrible events in Ukraine, which are unfolding right now as we speak. Many of you will know I'm running the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC and also publish a policy paper series called the Krasno Analysis. Our website is krasnoevents.com. And if you would like to join our mailing list, please send me an email to laris@unc.edu or use the form on the website. Thank you very much. The situation in Ukraine is further escalating. A dialogue process has also been instigating, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now. This event tonight is meant to help us understand why the war in Ukraine came about and what the nature of Ukrainian-Russian relations is like. We will also ask, could the war have been prevented? And is there still a chance to stop it now and find a negotiated compromise solution? We will look at Putin's Russia, Zelensky's Ukraine, and consider the policies of the United States, the Europeans and the European Union, but also China. Finally, we will assess how the global order has been changed and will be further changed by this terrible new war in Europe. And we all, I think, believed that war in Europe was really a thing of the past, but now it has come back with a vengeance, unfortunately. We have four fabulous speakers and discussants. They will all make brief initial remarks of some 4 to 5 minutes before we address your many questions. Our first speaker is Ambassador Barbara Stevenson, who is now Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Chief Global Officer at UNC. And she will be here in a minute. She's a former US Ambassador to Panama, Deputy and Acting Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and she has held many other distinguished diplomatic positions, including Consul General in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where we actually met for the first time quite a few years ago now. Our second speaker is Admiral Dennis Blair. Admiral Blair now is a not distinguished visiting professor of the practice at UNC. Dennis has held many distinguished positions in the US Navy and served in high-level administrative positions under 5 presidents. Not least, he was Commander and Chief of the US Pacific Command. He also served as President Obama's first Director of National Intelligence. Professor Erin Whittaker is now a professor of the practice at UNC. She is a former senior analyst for the CIA and the US State Department. She has 15 years of policy experience in Washington, D.C. and abroad. In her teaching and writing, she focuses on the dynamic between senior policymakers and the intelligence community and on how to write and interpret intelligence information. And I think we all want to know more about that. Then there is Professor Graham Robertson. He's a professor of political science and the Glass Distinguished Professor at UNC. He also is the director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at UNC. Graham's work focuses on political protest and regime support in authoritarian regimes. Graham is an expert on Russia and on Putin in particular. He has recently co-authored an impressive study on Putin versus the people. And I'm also at UNC, as you know, but I'm now joining you today from a research fellowship in Washington, D.C. I'm doing research on the difficult relations between the United States, Europe, and China in the recent past. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We have an exceptionally large audience, and I thank you all for your great interest in our evening tonight. Our first speaker is Ambassador Barbara Stevenson. She will enlighten us about the diplomacy in the run-up to the war and about what is going on today. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Klaus. And it's great to be with you and with this whole distinguished panel and this really wonderfully large audience that's turned out. Thank you all for being here. So the question for me in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, has American diplomacy been effective? And I think that the Biden administration generally, and perhaps almost universally, gets high marks for working closely, assiduously, and effectively with our NATO allies to maintain alliance unity in the face of Russian aggression. Buy-in to the remarkably robust set of sanctions extends beyond even NATO allies to neutral countries such as Switzerland and Sweden. And that's a big achievement, and it reflects effective diplomacy and a determination to do the hard work of building a united response. It also reflects horror at Putin's raw aggression and horror at Ukraine's vulnerability to Russian attack. And it reflects a profound admiration for the determination of the Ukrainian people and the steadfastness of Ukraine's democratically elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has emerged as a hero for our times. So while other factors fed into the unified opposition to Putin that we now see, recent American diplomacy has been highly effective, and I give it high marks, perhaps even an A. But as UNC students who've been coming to talks over here in the FedEx Global Education Center know, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, American diplomacy didn't begin a month ago. It goes back at least 20 years and maybe even 30 if we reach back to a key disputed piece of history. Did the US promise the Russians in 1990, when Russia agreed to a united Germany joining NATO, that there would be no expansion of NATO jurisdiction or forces 1 inch to the east of the borders of a reunified Germany? And that quote comes from William Burns' book, The Back Channel, and he recalls the conversation with Baker and Shevardnadze. Under the New Diplomacy Initiative, UNC students had the chance to explore this history in diplomatic context and a chance to hear from and talk to, for example, Ambassador John Tefft, former US ambassador to both Moscow and Kyiv, as well as Georgia, which Russia also invaded. Our students also heard from and talked to Ambassador Steve Mull, former US ambassador to Warsaw. New York Times journalist Roger Cohen, who has written brilliantly on Russia and Ukraine in recent days, was invited to speak to UNC students by the Center for European Studies. And the Belgian ambassador to the US, whom Klaus Lars brought to campus in January, also provided students remarkable context for understanding the war in Ukraine, drawing on his own recent experience serving in Russia. Memorably, he told of being assailed by a Russian policeman while he was walking in a park with his daughter in St. Petersburg. Once the Russian cop understood the ambassador was from Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, the cop turned hostile and he asked harshly why NATO was determined to come right up to Russia's borders and threaten Russians. Vignettes like that stick, and good diplomats don't just ignore them or dismiss them out of hand. These speakers and others have helped us understand the history of this invasion and prepared us to make independent assessments of what we're hearing through various media. I, for one, am skeptical when I hear an expert dismiss as rubbish, or even more harshly, lies, the assertion that Putin and many Russians are now and have long been concerned about NATO's eastward expansion. Dr. Robertson, who is an expert in Russian public opinion, may talk more about this. And I will just say now that I think his excellent piece in the Sunday Washington Post points to the beginnings of an answer to the question tonight's panel poses. What now? As in, is there a diplomatic off-ramp still available that spares Ukraine and her brave people further destruction? As stirring as Ukrainian resistance to Putin's aggression is, the fact remains that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people face terrible harm if this war continues. It's already produced nearly 1 million refugees and many more internally displaced. Kyiv, a city of 3 million people, is braced for a full-scale attack, and each dawn brings images of new destruction, buildings disemboweled by Russian military attacks, and children's stuffed toys lying in the rubbish. As I survey how vulnerable Ukraine is and accept the decision that US troops are not going to go in and fight beside those brave Ukrainians, I have to ask whether it was really in Ukraine's or our best interest for NATO to declare in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia, quote, will become members of NATO. That diplomatic step has left Ukraine, quote, floating in a sea of treacherous vagueness. That's from Roger Cohen in a recent New York Times article. With regret, I cannot give high marks to the longer term American diplomacy that has brought us to this point.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for your views and your insights. You gave the American diplomats, the American diplomacy, very high marks. However, diplomacy is supposed to succeed, and we have a war on our hands. So obviously, American diplomacy did not succeed. Are you sure these high marks are justified? Couldn't they have done more?
So, Klaus, I give them high marks for getting NATO unity over the last few months. I don't give us high marks for the long march to this point. I believe that this was foreseeable. Indeed, if you read Bill Burns's book, I first met him when he was the political counselor in Moscow, and I was working for Tom Pickering, who was the former ambassador to Moscow, who Bill reported to. I've gone back and looked carefully at his recounting. At every step of the way, Embassy Moscow, the US Embassy in Moscow with William Burns and Tom Pickering was pointing out how this would not come to a good end. And here we are. So, Klaus, I don't give us high marks over the long term. I believe the long march up to this has actually not been a hand well played. And I feel a very heartfelt sense of responsibility for the scenes of Ukrainians fleeing and families being torn apart. It's a very hard thing to watch.
Of course it is. Just a quick follow-up question. So you don't think that at the last minute, maybe days or weeks before the invasion, it would have been possible to offer them a treaty? I mean, offer Putin a treaty for Ukraine not to join NATO forever and maybe make Ukraine a neutral country. Would that not have done the trick?
It would have done the trick, Klaus, and I heard people float that. It would have done the trick. And I think that's a really fair point.
Well, but very sad if, that it wasn't taken up, that we have a war because of that. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Let's
go to we will develop that further, of course, in the course of the evening. Our second speaker is Admiral Dennis Blair. He will tell us about the military and naval strategies employed by Russia and Ukraine, and he will also consider if the war in Ukraine may lead to further tension with China over Taiwan, for example. Over to you, Dennis, please.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. A couple of points on the military aspects of what we're seeing in the Ukraine, because once the fighting starts, a lot of the future will depend on how it goes. I'd say the first point is that clearly this is not what President Putin anticipated when he gave the word to his troops to go in. It's pretty clear that he was anticipating a few armor columns going into Kyiv, going into Kharkiv, the Ukrainian government folding, and the Russians able to put in another puppet government of the type they had had before 2014, and that the Ukraine would turn into basically a subservient state to Russia, the way it had been. And it's really clear that there is very shoddy, incomplete, and unrealistic planning by Russia before they started this attack, and they're paying the price for that now. You just don't leave a 40-mile convoy of military equipment on a road leading to the capital city if you have a decent battle plan. You have 40 miles of sitting ducks there, which can be disabled by irregular forces from the Ukraine. That will jam up the highway even further, making it more impossible to move. And it's absolutely clear that the Russians were way overconfident in what they were trying to do, and they're paying the price for it now. So, one other thing I think that's important before we go on about what would happen in the future. I've been surprised by the lack of cyber activity in conjunction with this war. On several occasions, the Ukraine was a practice field for the Russians making cyber attacks, most notably against a power station in the Ukraine, which Russian hackers disabled. And most of us thought that a strong cyber attack would be part of the Russian attack plan to try to cut Ukrainian command and control, to try to scare Ukrainian citizens, and we really have not seen that. There's been some, but the Ukrainians have been able to keep it under control. So where do we go in the future? It's clear that Putin seems little inclined to back down at this point, but feels that he must press on once he has given the order to attack. And the only way the Russians know how to press on in these circumstances are more firepower, more indiscriminate destruction of the type that we are seeing. It was the pattern that they displayed as recently as the Chechen War, when they basically leveled the city of Grozny in order to take it. And so I think we will see a increase in Russian firepower. As for the Ukrainians, I think that they still have a number of escalatory moves up their sleeves as well. I've been quite surprised that we have not seen IEDs in greater numbers from the Ukrainians. These are relatively simple devices. They're only one step up from the Molotov cocktails that we have seen being made by Ukrainian citizens, and they gave the United States troops fits in both Iraq and Afghanistan until we learned how to deal with them, and they would be the same for the Russians. So I'm not one who says that, oh, the Russians can bring whatever firepower they have to bear and they will inevitably march through the Ukraine. I think the Ukrainian resistance has many tricks that it can use as well. If the Russians do succeed, and I would have to give odds that they will gradually prevail, I would see the Ukrainian government retreating to an enclave to the west, keeping the border with China, shortening their supply lines, still heavily supplied by European countries and the United States and other NATO countries coming across the border with NATO. Meanwhile, a very strong resistance insurgent movement within the eastern part of the Ukraine that the Russians will have overrun, and this thing could go on for a very long time with an intact Ukrainian government to the west. Quickly, in my just the last 30 seconds, does this mean that China will be emboldened to make a move in Taiwan, which they threatened for years? No, quite simply, the situation there is entirely different. The military situation is much more difficult for the Chinese than is the Ukraine situation for the Russians. The United States forces are much more able to come to bear quickly, and I don't think that the Chinese will be emboldened to make a move on Taiwan, copying what the Russians seem to have decided was their moment to attack the Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Very interesting. Let me ask you, you said that Putin was overconfident and therefore underestimated what the Ukrainians can do. Why is that? I mean, he knew the Ukrainians would be supported by the West. Has he lost it? Has he lost his sense of realism? Or how do we explain that?
I would just say that that arrogance and overconfidence is a common disease of leaders of big countries dealing with small countries, not unknown in countries like the United States, for example, and in a dictatorship like Russia, there are all sorts of things which reinforce that, the sycophancy of the people around him. I mean, we've even just seen displayed on Russian television these bizarre tantrums that Putin is showing towards his subordinates. Incredible. And so I think he just fell in love with what he saw in the mirror every morning and valued his own judgment. His advisors who could talk to him in stark terms have all been sort of moved away, and he just became a one-person decision, and he just way overreached.
Okay, thank you. A quick follow-up question. We see the Russians increasingly pummeling the Ukrainian army, particularly the cities and towns, and waves of refugee, destroyed buildings. It's a terrible carnage. And a lot of people in Western countries, in Europe, in the US, increasingly ask, should NATO just stand by and just deliver goods, but otherwise be passive, not help the Ukrainians more actively with air power, with troops even? What would you say about that pressure, which I'm sure will be ratcheting up over the next few weeks as well?
I mean, that's a core political decision for NATO and the United States to make. It's well outside of NATO's treaty. It would be a humanitarian decision based on, as you said, what appears on television screens. My own experience is that based on decisions based on television screens are often not the best decisions. Countries and alliances have to think these things all the way through, not just stop the suffering, but how do we want this thing to end? And so I would not react to. I mean, war is terrible, but defending your country is heroic, and this is where we are, and we need to think both with our head and with our hearts on this one.
Thanks very much. Let's come to our next speaker, that is Professor Erin Whittaker. Erin will look at the intelligence information released before the war and how intelligence has been influencing the conduct of the war in Ukraine so far. Over to you, Erin.
Right, thank you so much, Klaus. It's an honor to be here on this team of speakers. Thank you to everyone tuning in. I'll admit, when I think about this topic, it's personal for me. After spending time in the intelligence community, looking at Russia and trying to make sense of the different pieces, and then teaching courses such as peace and war to our students here at UNC. And we teach about a continuum between peace and war, but in the classroom, we're watching this unfold on super speed and in real time. And in some ways, it reminds me of the experience of watching 9/11 as a college student. But when I think about the role of intelligence in this conflict, really come down with 3 key points for tonight. And the first one is what's new about what's going on. The second one is why that's significant. And the third one is what's next. So in terms of what's new, I've gone back and I've looked at a timeline of the disclosures that have come out. And I should caveat that when I say disclosures, I'm primarily talking about authorized disclosures. So those are disclosures that have come out that have been sanctioned by executive branch, by the intelligence community, by the State Department. We've seen it from the National Security Council. And when I've looked at this timeline, as opposed to other timelines, such as in 2003 or under the previous administration, is a whole of government approach and a frequency of the disclosures that I haven't seen looking at other events. And so we saw this kick off, for example, December 4th, with reports that came out from the Biden administration about 175,000 troops, half of which may have been deployed to Ukraine at that time. And then if you look at the frequency between about February 3rd and the invasion, it's about every other day that you see reports coming out, and fairly specific reports, for example, about films that Putin may use and ways that he may leverage his information campaign. And I'll also highlight, we also see this on the UK side. So if you look at the Twitter campaign, for example, of MI6, the security services in the UK, we see different intelligence coming out, but largely compatible intelligence. And that pace, again, is different than the pace when you go back and look at the Iraq War. Some people have compared this to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Again, if you go back and you see Kennedy's statements of imagery, it's really comes down to one key statement rather than what we've seen, which was from the National Security Council, Department of State, the Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence, which Admiral Blair held position, really that whole of government approach. And I would just highlight again, this is also different than the recent history. If we think back to disclosures under the previous administration coming out of the DNI or the Directorate of National Intelligence and potential allegations that those were not sanctioned by CIA. So in terms of why that's significant, in many of our courses on national security, we think about intelligence fulfilling four key functions: a collection of information that's trying to steal secrets simply through human assets, through intercepts, through imagery, an analysis of that information. That's largely what I spent my career doing, and trying to parse together the pieces to give policymakers foreign insight, covert action or direct action that subverts the hand of the US, and then relationship with society. And when I ask students where they think the US gets highest remarks or lowest remarks, to build on your example, Ambassador Stevenson, they come back to relationship with society as needing work. And we see that play out in survey data as well. For example, a recent survey came out in 2020 from UT Austin that talked about how most people thought that the intelligence community could benefit from giving more transparency as long as they still kept the secret. And so I think that we're seeing a real change here for that relationship with society. No doubt it's been battered by things like unauthorized disclosures on enhanced interrogation techniques, domestic surveillance, black sites. But I think that you see the American public watching the warning role of intelligence, which is one that it's supposed to play. In terms of what's next, I think it gets a lot messier and harder, to be honest. Gregory Treverton, who's a national security expert, talks about intelligence mysteries or puzzles. And puzzles, he defines as something that can be solved. What does the imagery show for the troop movement? What is terrorist financing? And mysteries are those intelligence questions that you can frame as an analyst. You can talk about drivers. You can adopt analytic techniques, which we do increasingly after the 9/11 Commission report, to try to stave off groupthink and try to avoid confirmation bias. But you can't give a clear answer. And I think this question that I see all over the newspaper, what is Putin's end game? Is Putin unhinged? I know you have lots to say about that, Graham. And when I see we have solid intelligence, I don't think I would just urge a lot of caution there, because I think it's a mystery. And again, I think it is something that no doubt analysts are working on and they're trying to do, but it's something that can be framed. We can look at rhetoric over time. We can look at all the sources we have, but it will be a mystery because intentions are so difficult to get at and they're so transient in their ability to be changed.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. But if I understand you correctly, that the release of intelligence information before the war, telling the world and the Russians, of course, there was an accumulation of forces and where the forces were, and then an invasion would come within 2 days or 3 days, and they were quite precise. That is a breakthrough. That is a fundamental change to how the intelligence community normally works. But my question, it didn't achieve anything, did it? The war still broke out. We have all this nice information. We even released it, and it didn't change anything at all. So in the end, let me put, not to find a point on it, it was another failure of the intelligence community to avoid something dramatic.
Yes, I mean, I would argue that the unity with which we saw sanctions coming out was an achievement.
Okay.
I mean, I also balked, honestly, Klaus, I had this instinct when I saw it coming out, and I thought, doesn't that corner Putin? I mean, to a certain extent, but so if that was the intent to defer Putin, then no, it didn't. But I think in terms of achieving unity with the Europeans, I do think that it did that. Again, I would love to hear Ambassador Stevens' thoughts on that from a diplomatic point of view. But again, I think that and that may have been the only area of success, right? That was possible at that point.
Okay, thank you. And then also intelligence information was released to the Chinese to put pressure on Putin not to invade, but also that it didn't work. Any idea why that didn't work? Didn't the Chinese believe the intelligence information, or were there other reasons?
I've seen those reports about the Chinese passing it to the Russians. I tend to be a little skeptical of that reporting coming out, just because I would find it hard to believe that U.S. intelligence would not assume that China would pass it to Moscow. And so,
if I may interrupt, I thought the intelligence was already in the newspaper, so anything they passed on they could have read in the New York Times, I guess.
Right. But I've seen reporting that says, sort of in the gist of it, can't believe that China passed it to Russia, right? I mean, and so that again seems a bit naive in terms of thinking about intelligence and intelligence sharing, as you point out, particularly because it was already in the newspaper.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We come to our final speaker tonight, that is Professor Graham Robertson. And Graham will try to climb into Putin's head to make us understand Putin's thinking, if that is possible at all. And above all, he will look at the increasing protest and dissent movement in Russia regarding the war in Ukraine. And there are interesting developments regarding that protest movement, Graham.
Yeah, thank you so much, Klaus. I just want to say I feel very honored to be in this company of highly experienced professionals who've actually done work in intelligence and diplomacy, and I've been at the sharp end of this stuff. I've been at the blunt end for a very long time, and so I've learned so much. And I have some thoughts about Ukraine that I wanted to start with that sort of build on some of the comments and topics that have already been raised. And since I'm batting cleanup, I thought I would bounce some things back. The first thing is really to back up Erin's point about we don't know what's in Putin's head, and frankly, I wouldn't want to live there or try to get inside there. And I think it's just there's a lot of noise about that, but at the end of the day, what are someone's true intentions anyway? Your true intentions change from day to day depending on context, and that's just too hard a goal to set, and you're just going to make mistakes if you think you can do it. And I think that's a really, really important issue. And I'll get back to this in a minute. I think it makes more sense to think about the structure of power and how Putin fits into that and relates to other political actors. On the issue of overconfidence, though, and the issue of Ukraine, I think historians in the future will be really interested in the issue of how it was that Russia came to make this spectacular mistake when it comes to Ukrainian public opinion, the determination of the government to fight, and the unity of the Ukrainian army, the kind of the sort of military, the holy trinity, if you like, of war. I've done a lot of public opinion research in Ukraine. I've been to Kiev many times, but you didn't need to do any of that to know that the Ukrainians were not going to accept this. You just need to have a cursory view of Ukrainian history since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is not a surprise to any of us who have spent any time in that part of the world, that the Ukrainians are pushing back hard and fighting, for every inch. And I'm just staggered that the Russian military intelligence establishment, which is after all huge, was not able to communicate this message to the leader. And I think once the documents become available at some point in the probably the almost infinite future, it'll be really interesting to dig into that. And just to sort of add on, one of the other conclusions I draw from Ukrainian public opinion is that even if NATO had offered a deal in the last minute to say, okay, Ukraine's going to be neutral and we're not going to move in, the Ukrainians would not have accepted that either. And so that would have had to be done over their head. And that's politically a very different thing than coming to an agreement. So I think that's we'll never know, but I think that's a very tricky set of issues. The other thing I would want to add relates to what Admiral Blair said about pushing the Ukrainian government further to the west, maybe based out of Lviv. That in itself would be one of Putin's would achieve Putin's goal. It would basically partition Ukraine, at least in the medium term, in a way that's very much been on his agenda. Like, he would probably like to take the whole of Ukraine if it was offered, but taking the eastern part east of Kiev would already be very, very significant. How well he could hold that, we don't know. But what's clear is that when they occupied Donetsk and Lugansk and set up the so-called People's Republics there, they were utterly unable to manage them. They were utterly unable to find suitable proxies and puppets on the ground who could carry out the job of governance in any serious way. For 8 years, they rotated through various different gangsters, many of whom were murdered, in either by the Russian security forces, probably, or by other gangsters in the region. And so I can't think of any credible figure in Ukraine that they could stand up who is going to be able to take the reins of government. And so that project, to me, I just don't know what they think they're going to do. And they're often very surprising. They're very creative people in the Kremlin, but that seems to me an incredibly tough nut to crack. In terms of Russian domestic politics, I think there's Putin made some wrong assumptions about Ukrainian public opinion, and I think maybe making some wrong assumptions about Russian public opinion. The assumption is that Russians' opinion before the war with respect to Donetsk and Lugansk and Ukraine specifically were kind of divided and largely ambivalent. About a quarter of Russians thought that the republic should be part of Russia. About a quarter thought they should be independent, and the other half either thought they should be in Ukraine or didn't care. And so this was not a high-profile issue. Conflict with the West, though, and conflict with the United States, and this is something Ambassador Stevenson mentioned, was very, very high. And public opinion with respect to the United States has been extremely negative, going back to 2013, 2014. And what's really interesting, I was looking at this the other day, it used to be back in the 2000s that you could predict Putin's popularity by looking at the oil price, essentially. So the Russian economy. Going back now since 2008 and the war in Georgia, the best predictor of Putin's popularity is attitudes towards the West. And when Putin's more popular, attitudes towards the West are more negative, and vice versa. And that's not a coincidence. That's been the strategy. And so I think they're probably very confident that they can play on anti-Westernism and turn out anti-Westernism up because of their presentation of what this conflict is about and the genocide and denazification narrative. And that'll boost domestic support and also give some absurd, frankly, justification to fight the war. And so this domestic and foreign policy strategies, they're completely interwoven and have been basically since the financial collapse of 2009 and the end of the Russian government's ability to grow the economy. So that's the bet they've made. But they're making this bet now. They have Russian state television, which unfortunately I've spent too much time watching recently, and the narrative is just idiotic, frankly. So people are watching this, and then on the other hand, they have their friends, their family, they have their social media accounts. If it's true, there are 4,000 Russian soldiers dead. I have no idea if that's true. It sounds very high to me relative to the numbers in Afghanistan in such a short space of time, but I don't know. But once guys start coming back in zinc coffins, word gets around really, really fast. And at the end of the day, Russians of all political persuasions trust their friends and family and relatives more than they trust state television or any television, and more than they trust foreign media too. And so the battle for this narrative is going to be absolutely critical. And if they can win the battle, if Putin's and his entourage can win the battle for over that narrative in public opinion, I think that will strengthen them dramatically. But that's going to be really, really hard. And so that's going to be something to watch very closely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Let me just ask you, so you don't expect a protest movement of any real size to develop in the big cities in Russia?
There have been protests all across Russia. And, maybe, it's hard to know how many people have participated because of the nature of them, but somewhere possibly in the region of 60,000 participants. This is significant, but there've also been 6,000 people arrested at these protests. So the clampdown and the violence of the clampdown on this protest makes the development of a protest movement really, really hard.
Thank you. Yeah. Let me ask you a second follow-up question. Putin has twice referred to nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons. Now we are all speculating, was that serious? Was it tactical? Was whatever? How would you evaluate that? Was that meant in a serious way, or was it just a threat, a threat to bluff, but to intimidate the West?
I don't know. I hope to God we won't find out either, right? It's clearly a provocative step. The administration, I thought was behaved beautifully around this and basically ignored it, which I think was the right approach. We'll never know until if he's going to use nuclear weapons till he uses them. But don't underestimate what Putin's capable of doing. I think that's the point.
Well, thank you for these very comforting words. Thank you. Let me ask 2 or 3 more questions before we turn to questions from the audience, which then Catherine will ask us about. Sanctions is really the only weapon the West has, apart from delivering weapon system and ammunition to Ukraine. But the big question, the big weapon seems to be sanctions. And sanctions, the media is hyping it up at the moment. They seem to be working, the cutting off of the SWIFT thing, financial sanctions, and so on. Is that really correct? Can sanctions work in the short run? Don't sanctions only work in the long run, as we see with North Korea or Iran, and even with North Korea, not really all that well. So is sanctions really, or are sanctions really all that effective? What do you think? Erin, would you like to come in?
I think that they can be effective. I mean, I think we've seen different narratives about this in the media. It seems as if in the beginning, I saw a lot of chatter, and I heard this from students as well. Oh, well, what will sanctions do? He's invaded, and therefore they're not working. And so I do think that the narrative around this has changed. I think that in order for them to be effective, though, and again, this is where I think it will be really hard to be disciplined, particularly with all of our allies. And this is where diplomacy comes in, with that we do have to be in lockstep, right? And so this big question about energy sanctions is still out there, and the extent to which there's political pressures at the US or in Europe. I'd love to hear Ambassador Stevenson's take on that.
I just wanted to refer to Ambassador Stevenson, because the oil crisis of the 1970s tells us that all the Europeans were looking after their own self-interest rather than looking after Allied unity. Will we see a repetition of that in the next few weeks or months?
So, Klaus, I think the question about, I'd share your general view that we rely too heavily on sanctions and that they're not as effective as they need to be. And so I think that overall analysis is right. But I don't think you can ask the question in general about sanctions. It depends on what they are. And when the SWIFT system was put on the table and it cut off the payments, I mean, people couldn't pay their hotel bills. So it had a little bit of shock and awe. And you remember with South Africa, when debt refinancing was actually when that was cut off, it just had a shock. It's very hard to predict which sanctions are really going to play out in a big way. And what I found is it wasn't the usual suspects on my news feed that were making this point. It was my business page news feed that were going, holy moly, this is really disruptive. And that is where I got the first sign that the way that the sanctions package came together, with the ruble falling by 30%, ATM lines everywhere, running out of dollars, blocking access to the $630 billion war chest that Putin put together when the price of oil went up and he put away the money to buffer them. The way that this was crafted seems to actually be having impact on his cushion, on the quality of life of Russian people, which will surely erode Putin's popularity because they haven't been happy about that to begin with. And it looks like some of the oligarchs are really being blocked from access to their yachts and their mansions in, Mayfair and Knightsbridge in London. So the way this package came together, I think it wasn't just the usual suspects that go around and talk about this. There seems to be genuine impact. So watch this space.
Okay, anyone else who would like to?
Can I ask one follow-up question there, Klaus? Because I'm interested in your perspective on this, Graham. I mean, I'm thinking about this sort of the neuralgia about the 1990s for many Russians, and sort of the way that Putin has used that for his own popularity. I mean, just when I see images of people waiting in line to take out money and remembering talking with people about that in Russia, do you see sort of weaknesses there, or in terms of his popularity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Putin came to power promising order and economic development, and while they've not had much development in the last decade, they've had order, right? And they've had a very strict monetary policy. For me, the targeting of the ruble that the sanctions did was really incredibly smart, and that's a real weak point. Collapsing the currency leads to inflation and instability that we've not seen in Russia since the 90s, and that goes straight to the heart of Putin's brand.
Klaus, I would add that I know you're doing it just to be provocative, but the intelligence disclosures didn't stop the Russians. The sanctions aren't stopping the Russians. I mean, come on, you know that this is far more complicated than just single factors. And what will stop, have history take a different course from what Putin thought he was going to when he invaded, is a combination of factors: the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, the strength of the economic penalties on the country, the way the people immediately around Putin think about how firmly these will be held, and if their country is better off with a different ruler from the one that they have now. I mean, popular opinion doesn't push dictators out. What pushes dictators out are when the people right around them lose confidence in them, feel they have a special deal, and then they tell them to move on. And to sort of reach for, as a former military officer, this idea of reaching for the gun of a no-fly zone or sending the troops in and so on, I just have found to be a mistake without making it part of an overall using a series of things in order to reach a goal that you're reaching with the people that you want to reach it with an output you want. So I think this is just a much more complicated situation here than we're giving it credit for, and it will be a combination of these factors played out with Europe, with the United States, especially within the Ukraine and within Russia, that determines how it goes. And in the United States, we're not a puppeteer. We play a role in this. We take certain actions, and the net effect of all of these will determine how it's going to come out.
Absolutely, and I fully agree with you. But you also have to see, when there was a huge humanitarian crisis unfolding in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, pressure on the West to use bombing campaigns on the Clinton administration at the time became so huge that they eventually felt they had to do something rather than just, as we see now, sanctions or delivering material. So I wonder whether also Western domestic opinion will put pressure on Western policymakers to go beyond what they actually perhaps want to do.
Well, you remember how long it took in the former Yugoslavia. That was a good, what, 2.5 years that that feckless peacekeeping force was in there before finally the pressure grew. I mean, these things take some time. You can't snap your fingers.
Absolutely. Let me ask you about the process of dialogue, which seems to have, well, unfolded may not be the right word for that, but which has started. A Ukrainian delegation, a Russian delegation meeting at a border town on the Belarus-Ukrainian border. The media often says we have to dismiss these talks. It's just show talks. The Russians are not serious. And the Ukrainian officials seem to be saying also contradictory news about it. Some take it more serious than others. What is your assessment? Is that actually a way forward which may bring the war to an perhaps early end, or is it really just a sideshow which will not lead to anything? It's difficult to assess that, I know, but perhaps you have some ideas and some insights, Graham.
Sure. Well, my thinking on this was just when I saw the lineup of who was going to be leading the Russian delegation, that we have a guy who is a rabble rouser and a former minister of culture who's, I mean, he's just a joke. And I could think of half a dozen people we would have sent that you would have taken seriously, or at least you would have said at least they're pretending. If not take them seriously, at least they're putting on a good show, right? This is so far has not even been a good show. So I don't think this is going to go anywhere in the near term. I'd love to be wrong about that.
Thank you, Dennis. What do you think? You're muted, I think.
I think at this point that things have to make a move on the battlefield before there's a basis for serious talks to happen. I don't see anything in the near term until there's more sorting out of how this is going to go on the ground in the Ukraine.
Thank you. And Barbara?
So I'm intrigued and spending way too much time checking my phone, but I see Lavrov, who's not, an eccentric character. There's a Reuters headline that Lavrov says Russia wants a list of weapons that can never be deployed in Ukraine. And I thought, oh, we could probably have a conversation about that. I don't know what it's rooted in. It's worth looking at, but that's a kind of a trial balloon that caught my attention here, because that stalled convoy, which I thought was a trick for the longest time, Admiral, it's starting to sound like maybe it's not a trick, and that they really don't have good maintenance, and that they didn't plan this very well, and that it's not going well. That's the hard part for me to read, because it's so easy to be played by Putin and Lavrov.
Yeah, and there are also news about desertions and Russian soldiers trying to dismantle their own cars and gas tanks and so on. But of course, it's difficult to know how much is actually true. Erin, do you have any more on that?
No, I mean, I think one thing I'm thinking of just with you bringing up that point is where everyone on the panel is getting their information on this. I mean, I think Ambassador Stevenson brought that up, and you mentioned state TV, Graham, but kind of what sources that the other panelists see as reliable sources too. I mean, this is something that students ask me almost every day.
That's a question of a former intelligence officer who wants to know more.
I mean, and I've been amazed, even looking just at the intelligence space, how messy that is, right? I mean, again, I was talking about this with Admiral Blair earlier today. You have authorized disclosures, but then you have former directors weighing in with comments about Putin that are not, I don't see as particularly helpful in terms of, if he is using the nuclear arsenal as a sign of strength or things. I mean, it depends. And so I think it does get very murky on this picture.
It's a very good question. I think our audience probably would like to know, where are you getting the information from? Perhaps also then to take up these same reliable sources of information. Let's answer this final question, and then I like to ask Catherine to ask a question from the audience. So, Admiral, what are you reading to get better informed about the situation?
I'm receiving no separate classified intelligence from my former organization. So I think, what most experienced senior officials do, which is you look at what you read in the news, you remember what went in the news in situations that you knew what was really going on the inside, and you sort of back interpolate to try to figure out what's going on the ground. So I find that a combination of CNN reporting, I do what's coming out of the situation. I do listen carefully to what officials say, because although sometimes that's completely duplicitous, a lot of the time it reveals, if you know how to break the code, what they're really thinking and what they're really intending. So it's really using your experience to figure out from what is being said publicly what's really going on.
Do you rely on any particular papers or sources? You mentioned CNN. Anything else in particular you can recommend, like the New York Times or the usual culprits, or something else?
Yeah, I think that the Times reporters are pretty good. They've been at it a long time. David Sanger, Steve Myers, all of those are pretty seasoned people. They have good sources within the government, which they developed over the years, which probably tell them a little bit more than the government announcements, and they treat that pretty well. So the reputable media are what I read, and then like everybody else, I talk to my friends and what are you hearing? What are you thinking? So that's. But there's a huge amount of just using your experience, and I'm sure Ambassador Stevenson and I know Professor Whitaker do it the same way. You just interpret what you see to figure out what's really going on.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Very quickly, what other sources you rely on? Very quickly.
So I don't have that kind of experience. So what I rely on is basically being very, very Catholic in my reading. You know, I follow very closely the independent Russian media. I follow state media just so that I know what they're trying to say. There's a lot of great analysts. The Center for Naval Analyses in Washington is a place that I go for the military stuff, about which I know nothing. And so there's a particular Michael Kaufman there has provided really amazing analysis. And then if you follow links on Twitter from people who are reputable, a lot of the journalists. There's also a Twitter feed called Russia in English that would be useful for people who don't speak Russian. A lot of the top journalists are on there, and you can very quickly get a broad range of analyses from there.
Thanks very much. And Barbara, quickly.
I have a 22-year-old at home who's in the Russian program. And so he does follow some of the Russian media, and he follows really helpfully while I'm watching CNN and then reading David Sanger, Tom Friedman, Roger Cohen, the journalists I trust. He's got TikTok and other things running. And that combination is so helpful. And I think everyone should read Tom Friedman's piece in the Sunday New York Times about World War Wired, which points to this fundamental weakness. Admiral Blair was running through the factors that add up. One of them is just this information situation. Putin has been really dominating the information space, and I think he's going to fail in this space this time. He did not tell the Russian people that he was going to do an invasion in Ukraine. He has no mandate to do it. Those soldiers that are coming out on TikTok recordings are all saying, they told me I was going to Belarus to do an exercise, and here I am being supposed to run over my Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Putin's ability to control this narrative, I think, is going to be seriously undermined as those soldiers keep reporting back in. I think he's losing control of the information space. I think that's one of the bigger stories that we have to keep an eye on. The search for a reliable source, Klaus, I think we're past that point, and having this hovering over to be able to look at where it's coming in from various places, I think is a new skill we have to develop. And the other answer to it is I asked Graham.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Erin. Quickly, anything you would like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think my information diet is pretty similar to what has been said, but I would just echo Ambassador Stevenson's point that when I ask my students, they usually bring up TikTok, right? And then they have been struggling in particular with how to confirm the veracity. And we've seen CNN, we've seen BBC be very transparent about how they're vetting social media in a way I haven't seen before. So that's something we're talking through in our classes. But I think it's a key aspect as we think about national security or any conflict in particular.
Yeah, I can recommend in addition the South China Morning Post for everything Chinese. They're very good on that, have insights. And then, of course, the various think tanks in DC, they not always, but often come up with interesting bits and pieces. And together with everything what you mentioned, I think one does get a fairly decent picture, but of course not a very comprehensive picture because there's an information war going on. Catherine, are you still with us?
Yes, Klaus, and actually
That's
that's
good.
a wonderful.
I was afraid you might have left us.
Oh no, I've been busy. It's a beautiful segue into a question we had several folks submit while they were registering, is the question of how do cyber attacks play into each side's defensive and offensive strategies, which I think is a little bit different from the social media aspect of it versus this targeted efforts, and especially like anonymous on TikTok too.
Thank you. This seems to be a perfect question for Admiral Blair.
Yeah, when you plan an invasion of another country, you figure out what is worth destroying from a military point of view to make your ability to win quickly better, but then what you want to spare so that once you get there, you don't have to rebuild it and to get the country back in operation. So, you know, the classic thing in the Mideast was oil wells. Do you attack them or do you spare them? So so the Russians, I've got to believe, went through that calculation, and I think they decided that they were going to slice through so quickly, so effectively, that they ought to just leave everything in place, because then they would own the telephone exchanges, the internet service providers, the social media companies, and they'd be able to turn them to their purposes. That's the only way I can make sense of their decision not to do to Ukraine what they did in the past, as I mentioned, against the Ukrainian power plant, and they have a pretty good picture of how the Ukrainian citizens and government use the internet. So I think that they basically made that miscalculation. Now they have their units that are inside the Ukraine partly, but they haven't taken it over. And I think it'll be that same calculation which they're going to make with just blowing things up with multiple launch rocket systems or bombs from airplanes or normal artillery rounds. Will they, in fact, try to disable the internet in the Ukraine and the phone systems and the other systems in order to make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to defend and frighten the Ukrainian citizens more? I guess the only indicator I've seen so far is that attack on the big radio TV tower in Kyiv, which, you know, unless they were aiming at something else, seems to me to say that they are beginning to think that they should take out some of this information infrastructure of the country they're attacking. But they can only, I mean, they could have done it, they haven't, and I think it's another part of their overconfidence.
But I heard a former ex-general on TV the other day who said that Putin has already lost the war. You think that is highly premature, I take it?
Oh, wow, yes. You know,
yeah.
It's, you know, the score at the bottom of the first inning is certainly, you know, maybe Ukraine 2, Russia 4, which is pretty good considering, but it ain't over for quite a while, and And I think we've got to be thinking ahead, and NATO needs to be thinking ahead. Ukrainians are fighting in the moment, so they have less time to think ahead. They just need to do the best they can.
Thank you. Shall we take another question to make some progress with the questions? Yep.
Another question that was asked in a variety of ways, and I'll do a two-part, is what would be your counsel to the President of the United States and by extension Congress? And additionally, there were several questions as far as what can people do to support the Ukrainian citizens?
That's a question for a diplomat, Barbara.
Whew. What do you do now? I mean, because I just came from a panel downstairs where we had Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who commanded U.S. forces in Europe, and he was pretty sure that that the Ukrainians were going to win this, and I was really floored by that. So it's fascinating to be part of this panel, because I'm with you, Admiral Blair. I'm like, you're kidding. You don't really think that. So I think we're in for a long game, and the idea that that this is somehow a quick victory for the Ukrainians and that Putin is overthrown and backs down, it just does not look like that's what's going to happen. So what is my advice? Maintain alliance unity. Use this as an opportunity to really shore up transatlantic relationships and to keep those alliances strong. I actually think that is an overarching goal that President Biden came into office with, that I cheered on and thought it was one of our most important strategic priorities. So I think keeping your eye on that ball all the way through the noise and the toing and froing. And I think, you know, I think that the temptation to want to, you know, come in and bomb that 40-mile convoy is so high. It's sitting out there like a sitting duck, and that doing so is it would be, you know, a mistake. So I don't see us really moving in that direction. I think maintaining alliance unity is one of the most important ones. And I don't have a whole lot of good advice, because my view is that if we had played our diplomatic hand more smartly over a long evolving time, we would not have ended up with Ukraine getting pummeled. And I think Admiral Blair's explanation now of what happened, which is that the Russians thought they would walk right through and they wanted to preserve all the infrastructure. Now, all kinds of things are actually making sense to me. Klaus, I don't have a quick piece of recommendation.
That's Graham. Would you agree with Barbara that the war could have been prevented?
I'm not sure about that. I think I definitely agree with Barbara on the long durée of the last 30 years and how we've made mistake after mistake. And I've been saying in rooms for many years that like it or not, the Russians feel they have a legitimate issue with NATO expansion. I suspect we would feel we had a legitimate issue with if, you know, we had an alliance creeping up to our borders, even when they promised us that we mean you no harm. We would want some more structured guarantees than that. So I think definitely that's been that sort of situation. I wanted to chime in on and make a promise about ways to help. There are lots and lots of different sources to donate money and donate other things to refugees and children and various different parts. I will put together a resource list for that by tomorrow, and Catherine will send it out with the information package. I promised to do that. I also wanted to say that, you know, I'm very glad for so many reasons that the internet is still up and running in Kiev. We have a session on Friday at noon, a hybrid session to which everyone is invited, with scholars, friends of mine who are still in Kiev right now. We're going to have 4 analysts from Kiev, and then other Ukrainians from around the world at this sort of listening session to hear what their priorities are. And so if you're interested in what you can do to help, look at the resources, but also come to the event on Friday and hear the voices from the front lines.
Thank you very much, Graham. That's very good information. And I think we all appreciate your call for donating money, for helping in a very concrete and practical way to, you know, the people who have to leave Ukraine or who can stay. And that list of, you know, sources where one can donate money to will be very welcome. And I'm sure it will be sent out tomorrow to everyone who has joined us tonight. Catherine, would you like to ask another question?
Yes, and to confirm. we
Before she
will-
does, can I add something on things we can do?
Absolutely.
I mean, I would turn little green men back against the Russians. I think we should form with others a base in Poland in which those who would like to volunteer to help the Ukrainians out who have military experience from other countries, or maybe expat Ukrainians can go and train and go in and take all of their knowledge and their contacts with them and help the Ukrainians. I mean, I'm all in on making the Russians suffer as much as they possibly can in this, in what they've done. I think that as long as we don't turn it into a straight NATO forces shooting at Russian forces, we should back it. And the Russians themselves have started these gray zone tactics, and I would feel fully justified in using them back against them. I think we should teach the Ukrainians how to make IEDs and kill a lot of Russian artillery and soldiers, and we should put in all sorts of ambiguous things done by the people who work in the places I used to work in order to make the Russian lives just miserable and help the Ukrainian people really slow down and defeat these people. So I would be a lot more aggressive in the paramilitary, deniable, informal area in order to help Ukrainians kill Russians.
Are you not afraid that the war might spread either in that way or in a different way?
No, I think if you cede all the initiative to a country like Russia and a man like Putin, you put yourself in a bad position. I think the defense of NATO countries is rock solid. We put forces there. We have the ability to look at what they've done in the Ukraine. There's no way in hell that the Russians could successfully go into a properly prepared NATO country that was supported by the full weight of NATO under Article 5, and I wouldn't be afraid of that. On Putin's nuclear blather, I'm sure Graham has read some of the loose talk about nuclear weapons, which has been going on in Russia for the last 20 years. Oh, we may have to escalate to de-escalate. Oh, our military, conventional military forces are weak, so we may have to use nuclear weapons. It's all nonsense. It's all cheap talk, and the Russians have gotten used to having cheap talk about very dangerous things like weapons. So if we are too worried about things that they're not worried about, we put ourselves behind in a very difficult position. We're not helping the Ukrainians like we should. I mean, I see there could be big opportunities coming out of this thing. We could end up out of this thing with Ukraine in NATO, in the European Union, Putin replaced, and really push back. I mean, there's some real chances here. So I wouldn't treat this as just oh my goodness, we've got to restore peace right now as soon as we can. I think we ought to be aggressive and take advantage of it against this thug who has invaded another country.
Let me ask a provocative question. The promise to Putin essentially that the US and NATO and the Europeans would not commit troops and forces to Ukraine, did that actually give a blank check to Putin because he didn't expect to have to fight Western forces, but just Ukrainians?
No, but if that had been President Biden, if I'd been advising President Biden, I would certainly advise him not to say that. There may be a time we want to fly C-17s into the Ukraine and provide assistance and help to them. We need perimeters around those C-17s. We might want to put in irregular forces to help them. There may be a time that we want to put in a humanitarian blocking force if things really get bad. So why do we say that we will never put why do you reassure a thug and a bully and a liar and a cheat? I mean, don't give him that advantage. Don't think that you have to be transparent and show what you're doing when he obviously plays by a different set of rules. The only thing he understands is power. The only time he'll back off is if he thinks he's going to lose. And I think we should give him every incentive to think those two thoughts.
Thank you. Let's ask another question from the audience. Catherine, please.
Well, Admiral Blair answered two of my pending questions. An interesting one is, what would the panelists think are the options for Russia post-war if they chose to de-escalate the situation?
Thank you. Erin, would you like to address this? That's a difficult question.
I'm going to take a moment to think about that, Klaus. You mind circling back to me?
Sure, absolutely. Any other volunteers who would like to address it? Graham, you smile. You seem to be ready to answer.
My other option was hide under the chair. So which seems. So the question was, what are the options for after the war?
Yeah.
Well, it's going to depend a lot on who wins, right? I would have thought. You know, I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks at the beginning, I think that whatever option that the Russians have in mind that involves holding territory in Ukraine is going to prove extraordinarily problematic. I think they showed how hard it was in Eastern Ukraine when they didn't face, you know, the kind of paramilitary opponents or IEDs or any of the stuff that the Admiral is talking about. And in doing it in the rest, and the population was fairly sympathetic, if not even supportive. None of those conditions apply anywhere else in Ukraine. And so I think I keep coming back to this, but I just think that there is no coherent plan for how to hold territory there. And I think they're buying themselves an absolute nightmare.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about mediators who could bring some sort of sense to Putin and perhaps stop the war under certain conditions. The Israelis have been mentioned, other countries have been mentioned, and also not least China. Do you see the likelihood of China getting involved in such a way, because they are close to Putin? If anyone could influence Putin, both with political and economic persuasion, it probably would be the Chinese. What do you think of that notion that China might be the one who could push Putin into the right direction?
Well, if you liked China's help that they gave us on North Korea, you'll love the help they would give us on Russia. I mean, show me a way in which the Chinese or the Iranians, or show me an instance in which the Chinese have been useful in dealing with international outlaws. And I think it's a pretty blank slate. So no, I don't think China has any inclination or skill to play any kind of an mediator role on this.
I also think it would be very difficult. I think Israel would be difficult as well. But it does raise this question of an off-ramp, right? Which we've kind of been circling around about and trying to think through. And I think you made some great points, Admiral Blair, about if there is an off-ramp for Putin and ways to think about that. And so it's hard to think through, it's hard to cede that power, the negotiating power, to another country in that scenario.
Barbara, do you have any?
I have to say, I completely agree with Admiral Blair. The idea of the Chinese mediating just seems fantastical to me. And I agree with Erin too. I think that, yeah, you don't want to see the ability to negotiate this. No, I think that there's not a mediator on the outside. And I also agree with Admiral Blair. There's more to this than, oh my God, war has broken out, we must stop it. You know, you need to stop it on some terms that don't leave someone a thug that would plan to do this again, emboldened to do it, or questions about Western resolve and US resolve. This now must end well.
Well, but it cannot end well for the Ukrainian people. They are already suffering. There's already a huge humanitarian crisis. I think this propels us to try to stop the war very quickly. Of course, you know, a good diplomatic solution, a good power political solution would be wonderful. But I guess, you know, the people of Ukraine want to see a stop to the war immediately and then work out the solution in a political way a little later. But what about
an unfair demand on their part, Klaus?
Say it again.
It's not an unfair demand on their part. Stop the fighting and then we'll talk. Quite frankly, I hope they can hold that line.
I know.
Do you
Catherine.
think that there may be a sentiment though, Klaus? I mean, just pushing back a little on that. Do you think there may be a sentiment that they've lost so much and they've come this far that they want it to be for something? I mean, you would have insight on this from public opinion, Graham, but I would just think some of the images and some of the videos that I'm seeing coming from Kiev that might be there.
I absolutely think it is there. I think at this point, they've been surprised at how successfully they've been able to resist. And so they're even more, on that train and not give an inch. There is very, very little, even one of the lists of demands that the Russians made was, okay, we recognize Crimea. I don't think there's certainly not Zelensky, and I don't think there's another Ukrainian president who would sign up to that. No. Maybe a few weeks from now, if the military situation is dramatically worse, but as of today, I just don't see that being a viable project. Giving in to and giving ground to Putin at this point is not on the political agenda in Ukraine. I don't think.
Right. If Zelensky had left, I can imagine that scenario, but it seems really difficult again with what we're seeing right now in Ukraine.
Yeah, probably true. Thanks very much, Catherine. Do we have one or two final questions?
Well, I do feel like one that was posted in the Q&A during now is, what would a power vacuum look like in Russia if Putin was overthrown?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Graham, do you have a sense if there are potential successors to Putin waiting in the wings, or is that not the case?
So the nature of Putin's rule has been to make sure there's no one waiting in the wings who can step in, right? And so there isn't any obvious person there. What we've thought for a long time is there's two ways that Putin's regime ends. One is in a planned, organized way, where they sort out behind the scenes who the successor is going to be. They fight it out, while Putin is on his deathbed and he's on there long enough to give them time, or it happens suddenly. And the odds of it happening suddenly, of Putin being overthrown suddenly by somebody in the entourage, have gone up dramatically compared to 2 weeks ago. And so we'll see, but it will be, it's likely to be messy. I don't think it's been easy enough to coordinate amongst the elite to fight those battles out while Putin's still alive. I think the example of the Novichok use that's been sort of high profile and ubiquitous over the last few years has really underlined for anybody in the entourage the dangers of speaking up. I'm sure the elite is very split right now. There are lots of people who are very discontented, but how they coalesce and who they coalesce with under the current conditions is really tricky.
Thank you, Dennis. Do you think Putin can survive this fundamental crisis?
I think he can. I mean, I'd be interested in Graham's ideas, but in my experience, oligarchs are not going to overthrow him. It's going to be the military leadership, the secret police leadership who have he'll be overthrown when he gives an order and nobody carries it out. And I think that boils down to the key security organizations in the country. So that's what you need to watch. Now, I'm sure others on the panel know better than I do, but my understanding was that that back in Chechnya days, the army really did bow its back against some of the direction that it was given, and really push back against some of the orders that were there. So there could be the army, without overthrowing him, says, we're just not going to continue with this. We're not going to this campaign in the Ukraine, which we're clearly not winning without destroying large parts of it, and we don't think that's the right thing for the Red Army to do. That's sort of one scenario. I think in that scenario, Putin goes. It'd be difficult for him to do that. The other thing is, of course, if he and dictators can do this relatively easily if they're following popular opinion. If it's going so badly that he thinks it's not worth pushing, but he wants to stay in power, then he comes up with some cockamamie but faintly plausible thing. I've taught the Ukrainians a lesson. We're happy with those eastern two provinces. That's all I wanted to do in the first place anyway. We're gonna pull back, and we will just keep the Crimea, keep the Russian-speaking parts of it, and go back to that situation. That's sort of the one way that I think that he could pull out of it as deeply as he's into it now, and still have a chance of holding on to a power.
And that is what you expect when you weigh up the options?
I'd say that's a 50%er. The other 50%er, though, is that the Russians just really turn up the firepower and take over large parts of lay waste to large parts of the country, and just hunker down and count on everybody else getting tired of sanctions, which happens in many cases with sanctions regimes, and then coming back on the other side of it weakened, but still in control of maybe 3/4 of the Ukraine.
Thank you. But next time we meet, we perhaps know more already. Catherine, one final question can we squeeze in? And then I would like to ask our panelists to make some concluding remarks about what they expect, how things are going in the next few weeks, I would say.
Several folks asked opinions if the U.S. would become involved in a more significant role.
Thank you. Barbara, what do you think?
You know, public opinion matters. It matters in Russia and it matters in the United States. And the last piece I saw, the last polls I saw for the United States, 1/4 of Americans were open to the idea of American forces in Ukraine. Now, this is going to evolve as we see Zelensky as a hero for our time, and the Ukrainian people are just so plucky and they hold on to this. But I think public opinion is against it. I think Biden has kind of ruled it out, and I think that Russia's nuclear doctrine, which is to, you know, use it at a pretty low threshold, is a very significant deterrent for the U.S. going in. I don't want us to go in because I actually think it would be a mistake, but I'm getting very, very taken with Admiral Blair's little green men in Poland training people to make IEDs. I do believe there's a lot to be said about that approach.
Thank you. Erin, what is your view? You're muted, yeah.
It's difficult. I mean, at this stage to kind of weigh where we are and what's coming next, you know, as we think about this approach and what the U.S. should or shouldn't do. I think I'm still watching and waiting to see, and we'll circle back with you on that, Klaus.
Sure. Okay. I think we all have to wait and see to some extent. Graham, what is your view on whether or not the United States will become involved in a much more serious way?
Well, I think, you know, from the U.S. has its own experience with occupying countries, and they know very well what makes it hard. You know, and I think you know, I'm sure Admiral Blair is not the only one thinking that way, and I expect that's what will happen. In terms of the evolution of this conflict, I think, you know, I absolutely 100% agreement. There's either they double down or they pull back to Donetsk and Lugansk and declare victory. Which of those they decide to do in the next is going to depend on what happens over the next week or so, and on their interpretation of why it's gone wrong. So is it gone wrong because we didn't go hard enough, or is it gone wrong because we fundamentally misjudged the situation on the ground and the reaction of the government and the people, and therefore we have to back down? I have no idea which of those explanations though, or some other they'll hit on, but I think that's what they're going to be thinking about and basing their decisions on.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left. Just a final question about the home situation. We have talked about Russian public opinion, Ukrainian resistance. What about the American people? There are all these opinion polls who say that many Americans, maybe even the huge majority of Americans, couldn't care less about Ukraine and are not really interested in what is going on at all, and don't want the United States to get involved in a more serious way at all. Do you think that in the end will be decisive, that the great American public will not be interested in Ukraine and the future of Russia and so on? Or am I getting that wrong?
I think that opinion is really malleable, Klaus. And what you're seeing is when Saturday Night Live opens with the Ukrainian choir singing a prayer for Ukraine, there has been a sea change in the level of interest in this country and what happens in Ukraine. So I don't think that that public opinion is firm. It was really low when all the pronouncements were made by the administration, no troops, but that number could change. There's all kinds of organizing to help Ukraine that may shift public opinion.
Thank you.
I also
Erin.
think,
Yep.
just building on that, class, I think it would be really fascinating, and some of you may have already done this, but to break that down by generation.
Mhm.
I mean, because again, you have people coming at this from so many different angles, depending on their experience with the breakup of the Soviet Union, with World War II, and from our students, the information that they're getting. And I have been amazed at how engaged students have been across campus. I mean, it's terrific, the number of events that Graham mentioned, but the level of engagement that we're getting because they're getting information on their phone in real time at all times. And so again, I think that as we see that as a tipping point, that's something really to watch as an indicator going forward.
10 seconds for you, Graham.
What Erin said.
Yeah, that's good. That's even shorter than 10 seconds. 15 seconds for you, Admiral Blair.
I was struck by the amount of yellow and blue that you saw in the pictures from the State of the Union speech, and there's no group of Americans who are more sensitive to public opinion than the people who were sitting in the audience of that State of the Union speech. And to the extent that they showed solidarity, to the extent which they cheered and all, I think is a pretty good indicator that that this is something that American politicians who represent the feelings of the people do care about.
Thank you very much. I was at a demonstration by the White House a few days ago, and they would have fully supported what you just said. The atmosphere was definitely very pro-Ukrainian and very emotional indeed. I would like to thank all our panelists, Barbara Stevenson, Graham Robertson, Erin Whittaker, and Dennis Blair, for participating so actively today, for enlightening us. I would like to thank in particular our huge audience, several hundred people who have joined us tonight and who have stayed with us throughout 1.5 hours. That is something they didn't switch off after 10 minutes, but stayed with us in overwhelming numbers. So I'm deeply impressed. I would like to thank everyone. And of course, I would like to thank Catherine and the UNC Alumni Association. And perhaps we will convene again and have a sequel, perhaps in better circumstances, when we have more optimistic things to say, and hopefully that will be soon. Thank you very much to everyone, and good night to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.